every person forms his own plan of his destiny in this world. Skills that he wants to gain, honor and leisure in the future that he expects from them, lasting happiness in married life, and a long line of joys or of ventures constitute the image of the magic lantern that he ingeniously draws and plays in vivid succession in his imagination. Death, which puts an end to this shadow play, appears only in the dark distance and is made obscure and unrecognizable by the light that is shed over the more pleasant places. During these reveries, our true fate leads us along completely different ways. The lot that will really be granted to us seldom looks similar to what we promised ourselves. In every step that we take, we find ourselves deceived in our anticipation. Nevertheless, the imagination goes about its business and does not tire of drawing up new plans, until death, which still seems to be far away, suddenly brings the whole game to an end. If the person is brought back by understanding from his world of fables, of which he is himself creator through imagination, and in which he so gladly resides, to that which Providence has truly designed for him, he is thereby put into confusion by a wondrous contradiction that he encounters there, and which brings his plans entirely to naught, by presenting to his comprehension insoluble riddles. Budding merits of hopeful youth often fade prematurely under the weight of serious illnesses, and an unwelcome death strikes down the entire plan of hope on which one had counted. The man of skill, of merit, of wealth, is not always the one to whom Providence has set the farthest end to his life in order fully to enjoy the fruits of all of these. The friendships that are most fond, the marriages that promise the most happiness, are often mercilessly torn by premature death. Meanwhile, poverty and misery together pull a long thread on the dress of the fates, and many only appear to torment themselves or others by living so long. In this apparent contradiction, the supreme ruler nevertheless distributes his fortune to each with a wise hand. He conceals the end of our destiny in this world in inscrutable darkness, makes us busy with drives consoled by hope and, by the happy ignorance of the future, keeps us just as constantly thinking of aims and plans when they will soon all come to an end, as if we stood at their beginning, that each may fill the circle marked by heaven. Pope Immanuel Kant. In this first of my lectures on Kant, I am not going to talk about Kant's philosophy. Rather, I'm going to talk about Kant's life. So if you are just interested in Kant's thoughts, then you might skip this one and come back next week when I will start talking about the content of those thoughts. And to be sure you can do that. I don't believe it is necessary to know a philosopher's biography. In fact, I believe that a good text, like a good book, a good poem, whatever, and this goes for poetry as well as for philosophical texts, a good text should be able to stand on its own. If you can't understand the text, if you can't understand a book without needing additional information that are not in that text, then it's not a good text, because the author should have put that information in the text. So a good philosophical text shouldn't require you to know about the author's background, about what happened at the time or whatever, to be understood. Nevertheless, I do think it can be helpful to know where the author is coming from. Since, after all, those texts don't get written in a sort of vacuum, in an empty space, but they are part of a discourse. They are a response in one way or another to a philosopher's time. And likewise, his life can help you understand better what he was all about, what mattered to him, what his aim was. So I do want to talk about Kant's life. However, I don't want to talk about every biographical detail. I won't talk that much about private details of Kant's personal life. Rather, I will mostly focus on his life as a thinker and on the periods of his thought, so that you will get a frame of thoughts for everything I will talk about in the upcoming future lectures. And maybe there's no one among our great thinkers for whom this can be done more easily than for Kant, because he led a rather quiet and simple life, a rather straight life. There were no big ruptures in his life. I wouldn't go quite as far as Heinrich Heine, who once said that it was difficult to describe Kant's life because he didn't have a life. But if we compare Kant with other great thinkers, there was less struggling, less uncertainty, less need to first find himself and his place. His life did go in a rather straight way, and one could almost say that his life and career are not too untypical for an intellectual in Germany in the 18th century, apart from the small fact that he on the side revolutionized philosophy. Well, Kant's life started on the 22nd of April 1724. He was born in Königsberg, a city which he famously never really left, at least not the broader area of that city. And Königsberg at the time was the second largest city of Prussia. Prussia had only become a kingdom about 23 years before Kant's birth. So during his lifetime, during the 18th century, Prussia should rise to become the main rival of Austria, which at that time held the crown of the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire. And Prussia during Kant's lifetime should rise to become one of the main European powers. And then about 150 years after his birth, and so in the 19th century, Prussia should be the power under which the smaller German states should unite into Germany, into the German Empire. But at the time of Kant's birth, Prussia still was quite young and more of a middle power. And as for Königsberg, Königsberg was quite far removed. Being in Eastern Prussia, it was actually, though largely German in population and language, it was actually not part of the Holy Roman Empire. And it was far removed from the centers of that empire, both from the commercial and political centers, as well as from the cultural and intellectual centers. I mean, it was quite far removed from its own Prussian center of Berlin, which, unlike Eastern Prussia, was located in the Holy Roman Empire. And I would say that was quite fitting later on for Kant's character, for Kant's being, and that was also quite beneficial to him. He could live a rather quiet and simple life in Königsberg, without being, well, submerged in the intellectual scrabbles and also the intrigues which plagued many universities at the time. He was like the sage of Königsberg, as people later, when he had become famous, viewed him, who had his place in this faraway city, and who from there was sending his writings, his texts into Germany, for others to then talk about them, learn from them, criticize them, build on them, fight over them. But he didn't have to directly be pulled into that. And I think that was helpful for him developing his thinking and not being disturbed too much. However, I want to stress that Königsberg wasn't some backwater, just because it was far removed from the center of Germany. It was, after all, the second largest city of Prussia. It also housed one of Prussia's 3 universities, the other 2 being in Halle and in Frankfurt an der Oder, which for the non-Germans is not to be confused with Frankfurt am Main, the more famous Frankfurt, which is the Frankfurt that is usually meant when we use that name today, but which is not in Prussia at all. And Königsberg also was an important trading city for the Baltic trade. So Königsberg, along with its German population and not too small Jewish community, Königsberg had also many visitors, many traders from England, from the Netherlands, from Denmark or Sweden, from the Baltic countries. There were also large numbers of Poles or of Latvians from the hinterlands coming into the city, and that too I would think was important in Kant's development, because, as I will address in later lectures, Kant was, in his thinking, in his principles, very pluralistic and very cosmopolitan. And on top of that, he was very interested in the world at large. He read a lot of reports and journals by voyagers who had traveled the world. And so I believe that this diversity and this sort of cosmopolitan nature of Königsberg back then helped Kant in not being stuck in, well, in some sort of German narrowness, but rather in having a more broad and more general horizon. But I now want to turn to Kant's family. As for his siblings, four of them died very early on, as was all too common back then. Out of those who survived into adulthood, he had one older sister, two younger sisters, and a younger brother. Though I don't want to talk about them further, none of them seem to have been terribly important to Kant's life or terribly close to him. Not that he was in conflict with them. He supported his siblings later on. I mean, as a professor, he later was the most wealthy one out of the Kant siblings. His sisters having married craftsmen or whatever. His brother having become a small pastor, and he not only gave them or their children a large inheritance when he died, but even before that, during his life, he supported them with money when needed. However, he doesn't seem to have had a close personal relationship with them. Probably also because they weren't on his level intellectually. They didn't, like him, rise up in the social class, but rather stayed more close to, well, to their origin, and so there probably wasn't there just wasn't a big connection. There just wasn't much to talk about between them, probably. So his siblings I want to put aside, but I now want to talk about Kant's parents, because those were important to him, and those did have quite a bit impact on him, especially on his moral character, serving as moral examples for him. Even when they had been dead for decades, he would still only talk good of them, and he would stress several times that not one single time had he heard anything undignified or witnessed anything unworthy from his parents. And one could certainly say that intellectually, Kant later on rose far, far beyond his parents, and that also includes his moral philosophy. But in his character, he more or less remained what they had raised him to be. And he surely had clearer moral concepts than them. He surely, with his moral philosophy, found a fundament and a reason for his moral principles, which they hadn't had. They wouldn't have been able to explain and justify morality in the same clear concepts as he would later on. But as for the actual content of that morality, they probably hadn't been so far behind what he should later arrive at. There are other great thinkers who first need to find themselves, who first struggle. And there are thinkers who never find themselves, and there are thinkers who do find themselves through their philosophy, and whose character is a product of their philosophy. But in the case of Kant, it's more the other way around. He already was in tune and at peace with himself when he did his great philosophical works. It was not they were not born out of a struggle, and they were not they were not a medicine for himself. They were not him trying to heal himself from his struggles. In his case, his philosophy grew out of his character, which was already there, and which was already there in large parts thanks to his parents. His father was named Johann Georg Kant, and he lived from 1633 till 1746, and he was a small craftsman in Königsberg. His trade was that of a riemer, and I tried to find a translation for that. I didn't really find a good translation, but essentially it is someone who works with leather and who makes leather straps of sorts. Riemen is a strap, and therefore a riemer would be like a strapper. So the riemer would produce things like belts for people or harnesses for animals, and with that you wouldn't make too much money, so the family wasn't wealthy. However, they weren't quite poor either, so they weren't starving or anything, but they certainly didn't have lots of money, and one could say that that part of Kant's biography is not completely typical for the time, because to be sure, in the age of Aufklärung in Germany, there was some upward social mobility, and if we look at the biographies and at the family history of the great poets and thinkers of the time in Germany, then we can see that there was a lot of rising up socially, but in most cases, for example, if we compare Kant to someone like Goethe, in most cases it happened over the course of several generations, of like 3 or 4 generations. So most of these great thinkers of the time rose above their fathers in social station, but their fathers had already before them risen up above their grandfathers, and many of the great thinkers came from fathers who already had studied at university. Maybe the fathers, had been the first to do so in the family, but this upwards movement towards more education and towards higher social status, it happened over several generations, not just in one generation. And there maybe isn't anyone among the great German thinkers of the time, except Fichte, who came from a simpler background than Kant had. So Kant doesn't seem to have suffered from that, and he would stress later on that at least in terms of morality, his upbringing and the way he was raised by his parents had left nothing to be desired. Because, well, his father seems to have been a very hardworking, upright, dutiful, righteous man, and a man who tried to instill that same character into his children. And who, in the case of Kant, certainly seems to have succeeded. But even more important, even more impactful than his father was the influence of Kant's mother. Her name was Anna Regina. Her maiden name had been Reuter. And she lived from 1697 to 1737. So if you do the math, you will notice that that Kant lost her very early on, when he was only 13 years old. She apparently had been caring for a friend of hers who had fallen ill, and then caught that sickness herself and died from it. But even so, even though he lost her so early on, Kant always remembered his mother very fondly. She seems to have been a very good mother, very affectionate, very caring, and she is described as a woman both of very big heart and also of a sharp intellect. And she was very righteous and very pious, and again tried to raise her children to be the same. It speaks of her intellect, that she was quite interested in the world and learning, that she, considering her social background, was quite well educated. Of course, her education had limits. A woman in the 18th century from the lower middle class, a woman married to a small craftsman, was not likely to have read tons and tons of books. But as far as her stations allowed, she did care about being educated. It is said about her that she had quite the good orthography, which is telling something, because if you read letters from the time, even without knowing who wrote the letter, you would probably be able to tell the letters written by men from the letters written by women. For example, when you read the letters to Kant, and there are a few letters written by women to him, they stand out by their horrible spelling. Which is, of course, because women back then, for the most part, didn't receive the same formal education as men would. So even when a girl learned how to read and write in a basic sense, she probably wouldn't learn proper spelling, and would then spell the words however they sounded to her. But the spelling of Kant's mother seems to have been quite good, considering that. And she also was very interested in the world, in the cosmos, in how the world worked. Kant relates that when he was a boy, his mother would take him out of the city and walk through nature with him, and she would point him at the various plants and tell him about them, tell him their names, and also she would point him at the sky, at the stars at night, and at least as far as her knowledge allowed, would try to explain to him the structure and the composition of the world, of the whole cosmos. And that left a very deep impact on Kant. In fact, he would later say about her, "I will never forget my mother, for she planted and nurtured the first seed of goodness in me. She opened my heart to the impressions of nature, she awoke and expanded my concepts, and her teachings had an everlasting wholesome influence on my life." And I think it is safe to say that not only his character, but also his thinking and his interests were influenced by his mother. Later on, I will talk about this further in later lectures. Later on, Kant would have a great interest in natural science, and that was probably also due to interest in nature being awoken so early on by his mother. And likewise, Kant would always have a soft spot for physical theology. That is, his mother, pious as she was, would not just explain nature to him, but she would explain it in a pious, in a religious manner. She would point out how the abundance, the diversity, the plentifulness of nature, how the vastness and the great and amazing order of the cosmos were clear signs of the creator. And this is what later in Kant's philosophy is called the physico-theological proof for God. And the thing is that Kant himself would later show that this isn't proof for God, that we can't say that just because nature seems to be so well structured, so well ordered, that there is a creator. And Kant would come up with another proof, or not exactly proof, but a reason to believe in God, and that is what he would call the moral proof for God. But even though, as his friends would later attest, in a personal conversation, he would much more often refer to the creator of nature. He would much more often talk with reverence about how amazing, how wondrous, what a miracle nature was, and show his piety there. Then he would talk about God from a moral standpoint, even though he himself in his philosophy had proven that this was the only proof for God that you could rightfully call it proof. So in this we can clearly see the impact his mother had left. When talking about his parents, I also have to address their religion, which now I already did in parts in regards to Kant's mother. But what I do have to mention is that they were pietists. Now, the pietist movement was a Protestant movement that had quite a lot of influence in Germany in the 18th century, especially amongst that social class. So the middle class or the lower middle class craftsmen and the like. There were many who followed the pietist movement, and well, the name comes from piety, or rather, well, it certainly didn't come from English, but both words come from the same Latin root, from pietas. And the pietists were a Protestant reform movement. They were unhappy with the Lutheran orthodoxy that had formed, which they perceived to be stale and too much in the hand of the priests and the theologians, and which they perceived to be too much about the dead, the empty letter of the religion, but not about the actual spirit of the religion. And the pietists wanted to not just go to church on Sundays and listen to their pastor, listen to their preacher, and then be done with religion, but rather they wanted to have their individual piety and their own personal relationship to God, and they believed that you had to live your religion at every time of the day. And one could probably say that this is not a singular thing, this pietist movement, but that it fits into the broader history of Christianity. Because if you look at the history of Christianity in the West, then what you can observe is that every 200 centuries or so, there's a new movement like that rising up. A new movement which is critical of the staleness and the orthodoxy of the established church, and which tries to go back to a more pious, more personal, more lived religion. And these movements have been met in different ways. They have been opposed and forked and persecuted by the established church, like the Cathars in medieval France, and they have at other times been absorbed and integrated into the church, like the mendicant orders in the Middle Age. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who became orders in the Catholic Church. And what we can observe is that when the latter happened, when the movement was successful, so to speak, when it was accepted in a way, and it became part of the establishment, then the same thing would repeat. Those once pious people who had wanted to live a simple life of poverty, of prayer, of hard work, of turning away from this world and turning towards God, once they became part of the establishment, they turned into the thing they had once rebelled against. At least they did so in the eyes of the upcoming generations. And so later on, like a century or two later, a new such movement would form against orthodoxy, and including against the former reform movement, which had now become orthodoxy. And one could argue that Luther's Protestant Reformation was one such movement, which, unlike previous movements, neither got integrated and absorbed into the Catholic Church, nor was the Church able to persecute them, to eradicate them, but rather it broke off and formed its own church. But that didn't stop the cycle from repeating, because, as I just said, in this case, the movement was successful in a way. They formed their own church. They became the established churches in many regions of Germany. But about 200 years later, just like they had once criticized the Catholic Church, they now got criticized themselves by a new Protestant reform movement, that is pietism. And this pietist movement nowadays has kind of a bad reputation. The pietists now are viewed as fanatics, fundamentalists, and as enemies of superstitious enemies of the Aufklärung, of rationality. And there are now lines of influence being drawn. There is a genealogy constructed from the 18th century pietism as it existed in Germany to present day evangelical fundamentalists, as they are known mainly from the USA. And that isn't entirely wrong. They have influenced and contributed to the rise of modern day evangelicalism. That doesn't mean they are the exact same things, though. And as for pietism being opposed to the Aufklärung, it certainly was at times. The most important such instance, or the most infamous one, is the case of Wolff. Christian Wolff had been the most important philosopher in 18th century Germany before Kant, and just very shortly before Kant's birth, there was a scandal in Halle, so the biggest university city of Prussia, where Wolff had talked, and where he got into conflict with the pietists there, and the pietists succeeded in making the Prussian king essentially banish Wolff, and Wolff for a time lost his professorship, his teaching position in Halle. And to be sure, there was conflict. To many pietists, the Aufklärers were impious, cold rationalists who had no feeling and no connection to God, and who were dangerous because they were driving people away from God. And on the other hand, for many such rationalists and Aufklärers, the pietists were fanatics and were superstitious and were irrational. But even though the actual truth, as is usually the case in history, is more nuanced than that. there were many people who were influenced by both, who were both into Aufklärung and into pietism, and I would rather consider both movements to be brothers of sorts, because there are some parallels between them. Namely, both are actual people's movements. So both don't have one single leader or one single manifest which births them. Both aren't simply some ideology that someone thought up, but rather both came about naturally. Both are natural children of their time, because that time apparently had a true need and a true desire for both of them, for a deeper piety and more serious religion, as well as for critical and independent thinking. And likewise, in both cases, we can say that it wasn't so much about a mere doctrine, about holding certain things to be true, and the conflict with the dogmatics, with the orthodoxy, wasn't so much about certain questions of doctrine, but rather both Aufklärung and pietism were mainly about what I call Haltung in German. So they were mainly about a stance, about an ethos, about an attitude, about the way you live life, about your mode of thinking and being, about your character. And both forked authorities. Like the Aufklärung questioned scholastic science and old dogmas that had been taught without being questioned for too long at the universities, and like the Aufklärung questioned the absolute monarchy and questioned the church with its dogmas, so did pietism question the Orthodox theologians and their authority. And so both ended up putting the individual, putting the I in the center in a new way. Aufklärung was saying you yourself have to think for yourself, another can't do the thinking for you. And the pietists were saying you yourself have to be religious for yourself, have to connect with God for yourself, have to read the Bible and pray for yourself. Another, some priest can't just be religious for you. So when looking at history, I would always take the fact of something, a movement, a thought, an idea appearing at a certain time seriously. And pietism did appear at the same time as Aufklärung. I don't take that to be a mere coincidence. I don't believe that completely opposed ideas just randomly happen to appear at the same time. And so I do take pietism to be a child of its time, and I would view the pietist movement as part of the Aufklärung movement if we take Aufklärung in the broader sense, and if we don't reduce it, as it is usually done, to mere Ausklärung, to mere Entwilightment. And as a further side note, I find it interesting to note that not just Kant, but many of the great thinkers and poets of Germany in the 18th century, people such as Klopstock, Herder, Wieland, Schelling, Hegel, Hölderlin, came from a pietist background and had been raised with pietism. And they may not have stayed pietists. They may have, in one way or another, all of them moved beyond the faith of their parents and teachers and beyond what they were raised with. But still, to me, that shows that pietism does seem to have had an influence, an aufkläring influence. It seems in their case to not have hindered them, but rather to have, well, at least nudged them in the right direction. Kant himself, though not a pietist in later years, and though in general an enemy of what he considered too fanatical forms of religiosity, an enemy of what he would call religious delusion. Even though he would later say the following about pietism, and I think those words can be taken both as a description of Kant's parents in particular, but also they can tell us a lot about Kant's own character and about what he valued and what sort of character and what sort of stance in life he wanted to achieve through philosophy and through Aufklärung. So what he said about pietism is, though the religious representations of that time and the concepts of what was called virtue and piety were nothing less than distinct and sufficient, one really did find the thing. Say about pietism what you want. Enough. The people to whom it was serious were distinguished in a venerable manner. They possessed the highest which a human can possess, that calmness, that serenity, that inner peace, which aren't stirred up by any passion. No hardship, no persecution made them miserable. No conflict was capable of provoking their ire or enmity. In short, even the mere observer was forced to feel reverence despite himself. And in accordance with that, it can be said that Kant's mother in particular did try to raise her children to be very pious and religious, but we should not think of her as some fundamentalist who already existed back then and of whom there are way too many nowadays, who just imposed a cult's rules on her children and to just try to instill fear of hell in her children, but rather she really tried to instill a true reverence for God as the creator of this amazing, of this abundant world, and a quiet inner righteousness. And once again, in the case of Kant, she does seem to have succeeded very much. But with that, enough about Kant's parents. I now want to move on to his education. He visited the Collegium Fridericianum from 1732 till 1740. That was a sort of high school in Königsberg, which was under pietist leadership. The headmaster of that school, a man named Schulz, um, was a pietist, so he was also very much influenced by Wolffian philosophy. So in him is exemplified what I said earlier, that it is too easy, too simple to just say they were both opposed. This man was acquainted with Kant's family. He in Königsberg he led circles of pious people who came together in private to pray or to study the Bible, and Kant's mother was one of those people, so she got to know him. He apparently also visited the Kant family a few times, and he took note of the little Immanuel, or Manelchen as his mother called him, to be a clever and bright boy, and he convinced his parents to give him an education. And at that school, Kant seems to have been a good student. Of course, the school didn't give a full or broad education as you would expect nowadays. It only talked very little about mathematics, and neither did Kant really learn anything of note about the world, anything about geography or astronomy. The school was very much focused on, well, for one, on religious education, or whatever was taken to be one, on Bible studies, and on the other hand, a classical education. So Kant would learn Greek and in particular Latin, which he spoke or which he wrote quite well later in life, and read some classical works. And he seems to have been a very good student, and together with two other students, with two friends of his, he would also in his free time read even more than he had to for school. They would come together and together get their hands on books, on works by classical authors, and study those works which weren't taught in their school. And the classical Latin authors, the classical Romans, left a big influence on Kant, who even in later years liked to quote them and could still quote them at length. And particularly in his moral philosophy, it is very much evident that he was influenced by Stoic philosophy and by the ancient Roman sense of virtue and dutifulness. After attending school, Kant would attend university in Königsberg. And what is noteworthy here is that more or less from the beginning he seems to have focused on studying philosophy. That is noteworthy because back then the universities were split into 4 faculties, with the 3 higher faculties being theology, law, and medicine, and philosophy was only the lower faculty, and it was not really a subject of its own in the same sense. It was more of a general introduction into scholarship, into education, and you would then move on to major in one of the other 3 subjects, maybe become a doctor there, and then find a job as a priest, or as a lawyer maybe, or as a physician. But Kant seems to have explicitly called himself a student of philosophy. Well, he lost his parents very early on. I already mentioned how early his mother died, but also his father died quite early. So at 22, Kant had no parents left. And I mean, they hadn't been very wealthy to begin with. So, as you can expect, Kant was a little tight on money, and so he spent a few years as what is called in German Hauslehrer, meaning house teacher. Back then in the 18th century, there weren't general public schools yet, and a lot of families, noble families, but also middle class families, would not send their children to school, but rather have them taught at home. And the teachers doing that, who would then often live with the family for a while, for a few years maybe, those teachers were often young men at the end of their university studies who had not yet, probably not yet become doctors, and who had not yet started their own careers and not yet found their own job, and who would survive as teachers living with these families for a few years. That was quite typical for the age. Kant is not the only famous German thinker having done that for a while. People like Fichte or Hölderlin did the same. However, for him it seems to have gone rather well, all things considered. If we look at other biographies of famous people, there are some who struggled with the families or with the parents that they worked for, and who had a very hard time during these years. Kant did still say later on in old age that his worst nightmares were those where he found himself to be a Hauslehrer again. But even so, he seems to have been on rather good terms with the families that he worked for. He, during those years, worked for three families. He had three consecutive jobs as a Hauslehrer. First, there was a Calvinist pastor, a little outside of Königsberg. I might also add that those years were the only time in Kant's life where he spent a longer period of time outside of Königsberg. So he still didn't leave the border area of the city. He only got as far as some village a little outside of the city, not really far removed. But even so, that was the only time where he didn't constantly live in Königsberg. Well, the first job he had was for a Calvinist pastor named Anders. Then after that, he had to teach the children of a Prussian major called von Hilsen. And lastly, he was the educator of the Count von Kaiserling's children. So in that case, he already wasn't a proper Hauslehrer anymore. That means he wasn't living with the family in the third job, but rather he already lived in Königsberg again, and was every week was taken from Königsberg and driven out of the city to teach the children at their palace. At least as far as the last of those two families are concerned, Kant seems to have stayed on good terms with them, even long after his job as a teacher for their children was finished. And the last of two, so the family of the Count von Kaiserling, um, was quite important in Königsberg. They were leading the leading salon in Königsberg, where many of the upper class and of the intellectuals of the city were meeting, and they would invite Kant as a special guest there, and would keep a close relationship with Kant, about which I will talk in a much later lecture again when I talk about Kant's character. As for the family of the Major von Hülsen, well, they were of knightly nobility, and they had lands there in Prussia that they owned, and it seems that they were among the first to release their serfs. So the matter of serfdom, um, of many of the peasants being unfree, being essentially owned by their masters, by the nobility, was an important social issue in 18th century Germany. It was discussed a lot by various Aufklärers, and several princes, several monarchs who considered themselves to be aufklärt monarchs tried to end serfdom, including someone like Frederick the Great in Prussia, a king whom Kant greatly admired. And Kant himself, as I will discuss further when I talk about his philosophy of law, his philosophy of rights, Kant himself very much believed in equal rights for all human beings. He very much was an enemy of all forms of slavery and serfdom. And serfdom was eventually officially abolished in Prussia a few years after Kant's death, but von Hülsen, whom Kant had taught as a teacher, was among those knights who released their own serfs into freedom even a few years before the Prussian state forced them to do that, who voluntarily released their serfs. And that might have been a result of the influence of Kant. Be that as it may, Kant eventually settled down in Königsberg again, and started his academic career there. He, in fact, had already published his first text, a book on physics, on a matter of physics, when he had just been 22 years of age. Some other texts had followed, and in 1755 he became magister, so what is now called a master's degree, and started teaching in Königsberg. And thanks to his previous texts that he had published over the years before that, he had already acquired a good reputation as a scholar, resulting in his first lecture being so full, being so sought after, that some listeners had to stand outside of the actual lecture room, had to stand on the stairs and try to hear, to listen through the open door. As I already said, Kant never really left Königsberg again, apart from some day trips into the countryside. He bought a house there in 1783, and in later years he would live together with a cook and with his servant Lampe, who served him for several decades. He never married or never had children, though, which, however, isn't too untypical for a philosopher. There are many in the history of philosophy, we can think of Descartes or Leibniz or Nietzsche, who never had a family. It took some time, however, before Kant reached a position of security in his life. An academic career back then wasn't easy. It could take many years of staying a magister, of teaching some classes, but not getting full tenure, getting a full professorship, and therefore, well, having an unsure future, never quite knowing if you will be able to keep teaching, if you will eventually get an actual post with actual job security, so to speak, and actual pension once you are old. However, maybe I shouldn't talk in the past tense here, because an academic career hasn't really changed all that much. It's not much more easy or secure nowadays either. In Kant's case, he had to stay magister for about 15 years. He did try to become a full-on professor in Königsberg pretty early on. He applied with the Prussian king Frederick II in 1756, so just 1 year after he had started teaching as a magister. And then in 1758 he applied with the Russian Empress, because in the meantime the 7 Years' War had broken out. That is the war which in the US is known better as the French and Indian War. So, as a side note, I always found it quite self-centered and egocentrical to name the war only after the part that mattered to your history, that you experienced, and not consider the whole of the war, because the war also happened in Europe, where there weren't that many Indians around, and here it is called the 7 Years' War. And in that war, Königsberg was conquered by Russia and was under Russian occupation for a few years. So during that time, Kant applied with the Russian emperors. But eventually, Königsberg came back to Prussia, and Kant still wasn't a professor. However, over those years, he wrote several more texts, and he became more and more well known and more respected as a thinker, also beyond Königsberg, also in the rest of Germany. And so he did eventually in 1770 become professor for metaphysics and logic in Königsberg. And shortly before that, he actually started getting calls to come to other universities. So in 1769, he was called to the University of Erlangen, and in 1770, so very, very briefly before he would in the same year become professor in Königsberg finally, in 1770 he was called to Jena to become professor there. And then also later on, when he already had talked as professor in Königsberg for a few years, that is in 1778, the Prussian Minister for Education, von Zedlitz, invited Kant to come to Halle, which was out of the three Prussian universities the biggest and the most famous one, which had been the university where Wolf had talked, and which was leading in Germany, especially when it came to philosophy. And von Zedlitz tried to offer Kant a position there, telling him that he would have more students there, more influence, and that he, von Zedlitz, could also pay him a lot more money there. As a side note, this Baron von Zedlitz is also the person to whom Kant dedicated his Critique of Pure Reason when it came out a few years later. And that was not simply him trying to kiss the butt of a superior, but we can assume that this dedication really came from Kant's heart, because von Zedlitz was actually interested in Aufklärung, and as minister was trying to, as Minister of Education, to make the people of Prussia more aufklärt and to serve and support the Aufklärung as far as he could in his position. Something which today is pretty much unthinkable in a minister and a politician. And when we read the letters between him and Kant, then we can see that they are not speaking to each other like a superior, the Minister of Education, might speak to his inferior, a professor at a university, and they are also not speaking to each other as a nobleman might speak to a commoner, nor as the representative of a government, of an absolute monarchy, might speak to a subject, but rather they are speaking to each other like one human to another. Kant refused all of these calls, though. It is certainly an interesting thought. It's an interesting alternative reality, so to speak, to imagine what might have happened if Kant had followed those calls. Maybe not so much the first one to Erlangen, but certainly the other two. Because Jena, while not a huge university, Jena was certainly in the later years of the Aufklärungsperiod one of the spiritual, intellectual and cultural centers of Germany. Jena, together with the city of Weimar right next to it, was where the great classical poets settled down. That is Wieland, Herder, and mostly Schiller and Goethe. With Schiller, who himself was later greatly influenced by Kant's philosophy, especially Kant's moral philosophy and his philosophy of the arts. Schiller himself taught history at the University of Jena. And as far as philosophy is concerned, well, the professorship in Jena for philosophy would eventually be taken up by Reinhold, who ended up being the one who popularized Kant's philosophy, and who in the 80s, in the latter part of the 80s, contributed a lot to the spread of Kant's philosophy. And when Reinhold left Jena, he was replaced by Fichte, who was certainly the most important of this first generation of thinkers to be influenced by Kant, and who would go on to radicalize and to complete Kant's philosophy. And as for Halle, I already mentioned how it was the center of Aufklärung and of Wolffian philosophy in Germany. And it was that very philosophy of the Leibniz-Wolffian school against which Kant would end up fighting with his three critiques. And when he didn't take up that position in Halle, it instead went to a certain Eberhard, who would end up being one of the last to cling to the old established Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, and who would end up attacking Kant, provoking a polemic response from Kant. So it is certainly interesting to think about what would have happened to imagine Kant in Jena or in Halle. But then again, on the other hand, it's not really possible to imagine him there. It's not really possible to imagine Kant anywhere but in Königsberg. He just was very connected with this home of his. He would say that he didn't want to move to some other place because his health was never in very good condition, and because back then, when there weren't many proper streets connecting the cities, the rides would take quite long and would be quite bumpy. That was just too much for his frail body, he would say. But also it was that in Königsberg he had his circle of friends, he had his connections, and he didn't really want to leave that. Even though, while we maybe can understand that he didn't come to Halle when at that time of that possibility coming up, he had already been a professor in Königsberg for about 8 years. But when he refused to go to Erlangen or Jena, it was not yet clear that he would ever become a professor in Königsberg, and he wasn't getting any younger. I mean, by that time, by 1770, when he finally did become professor, he was already 46. He himself was quite aware of the fact that his time was running out, and that if he wouldn't get a professorship soon, he would probably never get it. And that would probably have caused problems down the line. That would probably have meant poverty in old age. That he still refused those two possibilities when they came up. And that he still decided to bet on an uncertain future, to still give it some more time and still hope for a position in Königsberg. that I think says a lot about Kant's character once again, um, about a certain, well, one could say a certain calmness and a certain trust in fate, trust in God's plan, one could say, or simply a certain trust in life and in the fact that whatever happens, it will be all right, and whatever happens, he will be able to deal with it, which makes me think of my favorite line, or my favorite lines, because it comes up several times in the Quran, where it is said that God burdens no soul with more than it can carry, which is something that in a way Kant seems to have believed in, of course, without knowing this line, without knowing the Quran. And that is, I would say, quite typical for a philosopher. That is not just Kant, but rather that is an attitude, that is a stance towards life that any philosopher should have. And I only have to think of myself. I could also think of my father, from whom I probably learned this, just like Kant probably learned it from his pious parents. But in my own life, it has been the same, that even in difficult or uncertain moments where the future wasn't clear, I still retained that deep general trust in life that so many people who aren't aufklärt or who aren't philosophers are lacking. But with Kant now at the peak of his career and his personal life goals accomplished, because Kant was not an ambitious man. What he wanted was to dedicate his life to philosophy and to teach philosophy. And to be sure, he wanted some measure of personal security, especially for old age. That's why he hadn't been content just teaching it as a magister, but had wanted a professorship. But that was pretty much everything. He had no ambitions to rise higher. He preferred a quiet life. He preferred his daily routine, his daily meeting and dining with his friends. That's why I previously said that he was quite well placed in Königsberg, removed from the centers of Germany. And in this, he surely differed from those that came after him. I mean, someone like Fichte or someone like Hegel had, in one way or another, higher ambitions to really shape society, and probably wouldn't have refused if they had been offered to, I don't know, become Minister of Education, while I can't imagine that Kant would ever have wanted such a job for himself. Well, so with Kant at the peak of his career and all settled down, I now want to take a look at his intellectual development. And his thinking is usually split by scholarship into the pre-critical period and the critical period. Critical, of course, is here referring to his main work, to his Critique of Pure Reason, which came out in 1781. And with his critical period, Kant became very productive as a writer. We can see that when we look at his collected works, which are collected in 9 volumes, and the first 2 volumes contain all the pre-critical works, and then the other 7 volumes are entirely dedicated to works of the critical period. However, I also want to stress that one should be careful not to overemphasize this. Kant didn't just suddenly wake up one day and had a sort of revelation or enlightenment, and from that day on he had this critical system. If you read all of Kant's works, including his notes, and if you read it in chronological order, which I would recommend, not just in Kant's case, but also in the case of other philosophers, then you can clearly spot certain critical thoughts of his already in earlier works. Maybe they hadn't been elevated in his own mind to the clarity that they should have later on. And maybe he hadn't sort of connected the dots yet and connected different thoughts of his into one coherent system. But nevertheless, there is no clear cut, and his later critical system came about organically, not through a sudden revelation or something like that. I could probably say more about this development of his, and it might be interesting, but this series of lectures is for a broader audience, and it is meant to explain what Kant thought and what we can learn from that, how we can aufklären ourselves through that, while I think the matter of how and when exactly he came to think what he thought, I think that matter is more for the scholars, for the historians of philosophy. So I won't delve into that here. What I will say is that the critique is a work of maturity. It is the product of a long life already spent with thinking, with philosophy. I mean, it came out in 1781. So if you do the math, you can realize that Kant was already way in his 50s, that he was already approaching 60 when he published it. Kant had always been a very independent thinker, even in youth. His very first book that he published at just 22 is a testament of that. It shows him already disagreeing with what was then the most held opinion, the leading opinion in Germany, and it shows him already daring to disagree with such important and well-respected and eminent thinkers such as Wolff or Leibniz. But nevertheless, despite this independence, Kant was, of course, influenced by his surroundings. And so we can say that at first he was influenced by the leading philosophy in Germany at the time, and that is the philosophy, the dogmatic rationalist philosophy of the Leibniz-Wolffian school. He was never a mere follower and a mindless parrot, but he was certainly no opponent to that school of philosophy either. However, in the 60s, maybe around the middle of the 60s, so when Kant was already teaching as Magister in Königsberg, he increasingly grew discontent with that school of philosophy, or with the then current state of metaphysics, realizing more and more that it was promising a lot of things, like being able to prove the existence of God, being able to prove the immortality of the soul, but it couldn't really deliver on those promises. And increasingly, Kant became very critical of the current German thinking at the time. What helped him in this was that he also read works by non-German thinkers. Most important probably to him were the works of David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both of whom helped Kant to broaden his horizon and to consider things from different perspectives than the ones that were then common in Germany. And this led him to the realization that philosophy would need to be redone, or metaphysics would need to be redone, but that it wasn't enough to simply try and erect a new system of metaphysics in place of the old ones, because that new system would probably be just as faulty, just as full of errors, just as full of unproven assumptions. So he came to the conviction that philosophy needed to be cleansed, so to say, that you first needed to radically and thoroughly criticize reason and to find out what reason could even do and where the limits of our reason, of our understanding are. And so Kant set out to do just that. And that is what the 70s were dedicated to. The 70s are called Kant's silent decade because for even a little more than a decade, he almost completely stopped publishing anything. He did, of course, teach. I mean, just at the start of the 70s, he finally became a professor. And when you read his lectures from the time, because we still have the texts of some lectures, you can see that he was already developing the main thoughts of his critique and that he was already trying to bring them into his teaching and to teach them to his students. But the broader public didn't hear about those new thoughts of his. Kant didn't yet write about them. He first wanted to himself reach more clarity about them. And so in the 70s we have just 5 works that Kant published, just small essays. Even if you put all of them together, it's not even 100 pages. And if we look more closely, we could say that 3 of them Kant only published because of the circumstances, because he more or less had to. One of those texts is his dissertation. That was simply customary, that was a required formality. He had to give a Latin dissertation in 1770 when he became a professor. And this is by scholars nowadays considered his first critical work, because here he already deals with some of the thoughts that would later make up the critique of pure reason. But it is very clear that those thoughts at this point are very new to himself, and that he still needs to think them through more. And I don't think that he would have published this work if he didn't have to become a professor. I think if that hadn't been the case, then he would have held that back and still talked about it more for some years. And then 2 other works of that time are 2 two very small essays concerning the Philanthropien. The Philanthropien was a reform school trying a new mode of education, and that school Kant was a great admirer of. But that school in the 70s was struggling financially and was in danger of being closed. So Kant wrote these two little pieces to, well, basically promote that school and to convince the readers to donate money to it, to this cause of trying to find a better way of educating and raising children. So, for that reason, I wouldn't really count those three works. That means that in this whole decade, Kant only published two works, which together make up not even 20 pages, two works because he really wanted to, without being prompted by anything or anyone. And as a side note, these two works, one of them is an essay on human races, and the other is a review of a text by an Italian physician named Moscati, who had theorized that human anatomy was better suited for walking on all fours than for walking on just our two legs. And this Moscati had theorized, therefore, that humans had at first walked on all fours like other animals and had only later risen up to walk on just their feet. And I think the fact that these two works are the only ones that Kant himself really decided to write in that time, the only two works for which he made a break from his work on the critique, says a lot about Kant's interests, about his interest in questions of anthropology and of biology and of, we would say today, of evolution. Questions I will come back to in later lectures, so I will talk about what Kant had to say about this. But for now, I want to talk about the development of his main line of thought. And here we can say that in the 70s, he tried to work out how to criticize reason and how to lay a foundation for all future metaphysics. And people noted his silence. Like, he got letters, someone asked him, why isn't Kant writing anymore? We are missing your texts. Because to be sure, Kant had already been a well-respected scholar, a well-respected thinker before that. Even though it is quite clear, I think, that had he died at this point, had he died before publishing his Critique of Pure Reason, we today would not really know about him. He would not even really be a footnote in the history of philosophy, and I certainly wouldn't be doing this series of extensive lectures. I mean, to be sure, his pre-critical works are not worthless. Some of them I would certainly recommend people to read, but still we only really know about them, and we only really decide to give them a try and to read them because we know of Kant being a great philosopher thanks to his critiques. And even with that, most people, including most scholars, don't pay much mind to his pre-critical works. And also, to be sure, Kant in his time in Germany had a good reputation, was respected by other intellectuals, but then the same can be said about people like Baumgarten, Crusius, Wolf, who were probably even more influential and more respected than the pre-critical Kant. And even I have not read any of those guys, while I assume that most of you listening to this will not even have heard their names. So, what really made Kant famous and brought him lasting fame, that was his critique of pure reason. And he also got letters by people publishing journals asking him to maybe publish an essay in their journal, but he had to decline in the 70s, saying that he really wanted to focus on this main work of his. And the reason that it took him so long was his intellectual sincerity and his thoroughness. He didn't want to publish half-baked thoughts. He really wanted to think things through for himself first. He really wanted to be sure about what he was going to publish. And he also, as he stated, including in his personal notes, he wanted to consider things from various perspectives, and he wanted to keep himself open to new perspectives, to the positions of other thinkers. He didn't want to blindly follow anyone else, but he also didn't want to be, and that I think is a danger that is often overlooked, he didn't want to be a blind follower of himself, of his own opinions either, but wanted to stay open to change them. And so it took him over 10 years before he got to a point where he was secure enough in his philosophical convictions to really write down his critique and to really publish them. And that, to be sure, stands in sharp contrast to what is common today, amplified by social media, where you can blurt out the next best thing that crosses your mind, where you can put it out there in some comment section or on Twitter, and where people don't take themselves and their own thoughts seriously enough to think things through. I like to mention the old Pythagorean practice of requiring the novices to stay silent for 5 years and to listen before starting to ask questions or to give arguments of their own. And this is something that is almost unthinkable today. And I think that Kant worked on his critique for over 10 years, should be kept in mind. It should also be kept in mind if you want to criticize Kant. Because I have often found, and not just lay people, I have found that when studying too, that people will hear a single sentence of Kant's, which probably was taken out of context. Or they won't even hear to that full sentence. They won't let you finish one single statement, and they will already disagree. So I have had cases where I started saying, well, Kant has given us the foundations for morality, and without getting to further explain, the other person would interrupt me and say, well, but there is no such thing as a general objective moral law. We simply know better today. we move beyond that. And those kinds of people don't really deserve that you even engage with them and that you even try to refute them. Because, I mean, they are not really engaging with Kant and really trying to refute him. They are just mindlessly disagreeing. And the sheer arrogance of that is unspeakable. I mean, here we have one of the greatest thinkers of humanity. And we have him spending a decade really thinking about this before publishing it, before putting it out there. And here we have a person who doesn't even take the time to try and understand what Kant said and why he said it, why he believed it, and who just mindlessly disagrees because what Kant says happens to be something that this person hasn't been believing in so far. And with that, I'm not saying that Kant is above error or that Kant can't be criticized. Surely there are errors in Kant's thinking, just like in any other philosopher's thinking as well. And with this series continuing, I will try and point out some of Kant's errors. But what I do believe is that even when Kant is wrong, his errors probably aren't so obvious that you can spot them by just hearing half a sentence about Kant's philosophy. Because if it was that obvious, you can assume that Kant, in this whole decade he spent thinking about his philosophy, might have spotted that error. So whatever errors there are in Kant can probably only be spotted by someone who really delves into Kant and really takes him seriously. They are not just lying on the surface, or else Kant himself would have already found them. But anyways, his critique of pure reason, as I already said, was published in 1781. And Nietzsche once said that every great thinker or every great author only really has one book. And all his other texts are either preludes or introductions or drafts, or they are additions and further elaborations of this main book, of this magnum opus of theirs. And just like in Nietzsche's own case, that one book was certainly Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in Kant's case, that one book was certainly the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant himself considered all previous philosophy to be sort of overruled and outdated with the publishing of the critique, including his own. He was, in his later years, not happy with his earlier pre-critical writings. When he, thanks to his critiques, when he became famous and celebrated as a philosopher, people in Germany, of course, wanted to read all of his works, and so there was renewed interest in his earlier works, many of which had only come out in small editions, and many of which couldn't be found anymore. So people in later years asked Kant to republish his earlier works, but he was always reluctant to do so, and he believed that if it was done, they couldn't be republished in their original state, but that extensive commentary would have to be added. He never came around to writing those commentaries, and therefore there was no authorized reprinting of his pre-critical works during his life. The 80s for Kant were then mainly spent on his critical system and on elaborating that system. The critique of pure reason for Kant was not itself the system of philosophy. Rather, it was just laying the foundation for philosophy. It was bringing reason into a state in which it became capable of erecting a real system of philosophy, of metaphysics. And so, therefore, Kant now set out to do just that. According to him, I will address this further in the upcoming lectures. According to him, philosophy can be split into two parts: the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals. And therefore, he now dealt with both those parts. And in 1785, he published his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And in the following year, 86, he published his metaphysical foundation of natural science. But the thing is that at first, in the first years, his critique wasn't really successful. Not because it was attacked so much, because that would imply that people would have at least have paid attention to it, but rather people stayed silent about it. There were hardly even any reviews in the philosophical journals of the time. This work was just too enormous. I mean, it had over 500 pages and too difficult, and most of all, I would say it was too new, too radical, too revolutionary, turning everything upside down, requiring or demanding people to give up their modes of thinking they had been used to and to get into a complete new mode of thinking in philosophy. And that was just too much for them. So, for that reason, Kant tried to make his critique more accessible. For one, in 1783, he published his Prolegomena to all future metaphysics, which is sort of a smaller version of the critique, just explaining the main problem that Kant is dealing with, and just giving his main thoughts, and which is sort of an easier introduction into the critique. And also in 1787, Kant published the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, and he made extensive changes to that edition. Not to the actual content, like he didn't change his thoughts, but he rewrote and he added certain chapters to once again make it more accessible and to explain certain things better. In addition to that, Kant also wrote the other two critiques because he realized that his critique of pure reason wasn't enough. Originally, he hadn't planned 3 critiques, and that is still quite clear when reading the Critique of Pure Reason, especially the first edition. He had only planned that one critique, and he had thought that afterward you could go back to trying to erect a system of metaphysics, which, as I said, he had already tried for metaphysics of morals and metaphysics of nature. But he came to realize that certain topics he had at best brushed at in his critique of pure reason needed further elaboration. And that's why in 1788 his critique of practical reason, dealing with morality, and in 1790 his critique of the judgment power, dealing amongst other things with beauty, with taste, came out. In a way, you could consider all three of those critiques one big book. And indeed, Kant had originally planned to deal with all of these topics in one book. There's still a letter which he wrote as early as 1771, so 10 years before the Critique of Pure Reason, where he writes about planning a work which then was to be named The Limits of Sensuality and Reason. And he writes that this work should not just deal with our cognition, as the Critique of Pure Reason would later do, but also with morality and taste. And the Critique of Pure Reason does brush the topic of morality and of religion in sort of the last chapters, but Kant had probably assumed too much of his readers in this regard. He had probably assumed that this topic was mostly already clear, and that here people would mostly already agree with him, and only in the theoretical philosophy was a thorough critique really needed. But he soon saw that that wasn't the case, and therefore also published the other two critiques. And eventually, especially after some years, especially after the middle of the decade, his critical system did start to get more attention, and disciples started to become very enthusiastic about it and to flock to him. But to be sure, that also led to him being criticized and attacked by the followers of the previous dogmatic Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy. And therefore we can see that at the end of the decade especially, Kant deals with and answers to these critics of him. So in 1790 he published a polemical work, a refutation called On a Discovery, according to which any new critique of pure reason has been made superfluous by an earlier one, which was a refutation of Eberhard, the professor in Halle who held the professorship that had originally been offered to Kant a few years before. And also at about the same time, Kant wrote an extensive draft for a work which was meant to be sent in for a contest by the Academy of Sciences in Berlin, which had posed the question what progress has there been made in metaphysics since the time of Leibniz and Wolff. And this was a question that allowed Kant to once again deal with and try to refute this Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, and to present the progress that he himself had made in philosophy. So this remained a draft, and Kant didn't in the end partake in that contest. It is still interesting to read, though, especially since it is the last extensive work of Kant's dealing with his critical system. Because after that, in the last decade of his life, in the 90s, Kant, well, he was already established by now. He had a big following by now, and he left both further elaborations as well as the defense against critics of his critical philosophy. He left both of that to his followers and disciples. So what then did Kant himself write about in these 90s? Well, the first half of the 90s, I would say, is mainly dedicated to the conflict of the faculties. That is the title of a work of his, which only came out in 1798. But that was only due to censorship at the time. It was already written and finished by Kant in the first half of the decade. And this text is a collection of 3 essays or 3 treatises dealing with the conflict between the faculty of philosophy and the 3 other faculties which back then existed at universities. So the conflict with theology, the conflict with the faculty of law, and the conflict with medicine. And I would argue, however, that the conflict of faculties is not just this one book, but rather that it is a topic which Kant dealt with for the whole first half of the 90s, and that other writings of his can also be seen as a contribution to this conflict with one faculty or another. The conflict with the medical faculty is more of a side note and is something that Kant doesn't really deal with much outside of the book, which is titled Conflict of Faculties. But the conflicts with the other 2 faculties, those are also topics of other works and other essays, other books of Kant's, which he published in those years. And both of those conflicts are not conflicts that Kant just decided to pick up because he felt like it, but rather in both cases there was an outside occasion for it, prompting Kant to deal with this. As far as the conflict with the faculty of law is concerned, what prompted it for Kant was the French Revolution, because that revolution started in 1789, and Kant was a great admirer and a great supporter of that revolution, and even, I mean, that alone is not that special, because a lot of intellectuals in Germany at first were supportive of the revolution. But many others turned away in shock and horror when the revolution started becoming more violent, while Kant, while not really happy about that violence and not justifying it either, still was hoping that eventually things would get better, and still saw that violence as something regrettable, very much regrettable, But still he was enthusiastic about the idea of a republicanism, and also about the idea of a system between the various states, between the various countries, which could lead to eternal peace. And therefore, in works like his 1793 on the old saying that may be right in theory but isn't practical, or his 1795 perpetual peace, and also in the actual book Conflict of the Faculties, he discusses the question whether humanity can ever become better, and whether there can ever be a rational republic, or a rational international order which will lead to peace, which would be the position of the philosophical faculty, or if humans are just rotten and it is just in human nature to mess up things and to cause war, and therefore humans need to be suppressed, and therefore we need a cynical politics which is about power and not about creating everlasting peace and everlasting justice, which would be the position of the faculty of laws or of the politicians. As for the other conflict, so the one between philosophy and theology, this one Kant dealt with because, well, in 1786, Frederick the Great, had died. That aufklärt monarch, which Kant had greatly admired. And he was succeeded in Prussia by Frederick William II, who didn't really try to be an aufklärt monarch, but who rather was an obscurantist, so an anti-Aufklärer, and a spiritist who was convinced that through seances he was talking to the spirits of his dead ancestors and getting advice from them, who was trying to get the upper hand in political conflicts with other states through magical help, and who at least outwardly acted very pious and devout, and very much in favor of the Protestant orthodoxy. And this brought about a sharp turn in Prussia's religious politics. Frederick the Great had, after all, been known for saying everyone should be or become happy after his own fashion. And under Frederick the Great, there hadn't really been censorship in religious matters, and there had been religious freedom. Well, that changed now, and that change wasn't just due to the personality of the new king, but also, once again, due to the French Revolution, because again, 3 years after the new king had come to the throne, the revolution started, and it was a common opinion amongst the conservative and reactionary forces in Germany that the mistake of the French king had been being too tolerant and allowing the intellectuals, the philosophers, to talk too freely and to criticize too freely, mainly to criticize religion too freely. The common belief was that the criticizing of religion and people losing respect for religious authority, respect for the church, and also eventually respect for the king who claimed to rule by God-given right, that had led up to the revolution. So now countermeasures were taken, not just in Prussia, also in other German states and principalities, and tighter censorship rules were established to prevent the revolution spreading. And for these reasons, in 1793, Kant published his Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, which is a pretty extensive work and can maybe be considered the unofficial forced critique. And here he deals with the question, well, is it enough to be good, to do our moral duty, to really follow our conscience, and that is enough to believe that we will be justified in the face of God? Or should we, to be allowed into heaven, into paradise, should we, in addition to doing our moral duty, also believe in certain historical claims about miracles that allegedly took place, and should we also do certain cult practices like praying, going to church, and so on, which in themselves aren't a moral duty, but which allegedly God demands from us. And the latter would, of course, be what theology says, and the former, so that we only need to be good and do our moral duty, would be what philosophy says. This led to Kant himself getting into conflict with censorship in the following year, in 1794. He got a letter accusing him that as a teacher of the youth, I mean, he was still professor, he was abusing his position and being irresponsible. And I think the only comment one can make about that is the comment that Biester made. Biester is considered one of the important leading people of the so-called Berlin Aufklärung, and Biester was the publisher of the Berlinische Monatsschrift, which was a journal in which Kant published a lot of his smaller essays over the years. Biester was a great admirer of Kant, and in a letter to Kant, Biester wrote that it is outrageous that a Hilma and a Hermes, those were the names of the two guys who were responsible for the censorship in Prussia. It is outrageous that a Hilmer and a Hermes dare to tell the world whether it should read a Kant or not. And I don't really have anything to add to that comment. Kant responded by promising to not write about religious matters again. Certainly, times and customs had changed and become a bit more civilized in the about 2 millennia since in ancient Athens, Socrates had been accused of pretty much the same as Kant, that is, of being a seducer of the youth, seducing them to godlessness. And since Socrates had been executed, in essence, for that alleged crime. The 18th century was a different time, and Kant certainly wasn't in danger of being burned at the stake anymore. But still, that doesn't mean that there wasn't a real risk of him getting punished and losing his position. I mean, it had not been so long ago, just 1 year before Kant had been born, that Wolff, the most important German philosopher before Kant, had been banned from his professorship in Halle and had been banished from Prussia. That was 2 kings before. That was under the king Frederick William I, for having dared to claim that the Chinese had good morals and a good moral philosophy, even without being Christian and even without knowing about religion. And again, a few years later, so a few years after Kant got in conflict with censorship, his most important disciple, that is Fichte, lost his own professorship in Jena in 1799 in the so-called atheism dispute, because he had been accused of being an atheist and spreading atheism. So it wasn't like there wasn't a real risk of consequences for Kant. But the king, Frederick William II, died in 1797 already, and under his successor, that would be Frederick William III, the censorship on religious matters was loosened a bit again, and so Kant again felt free to publish about it, and finally published his Conflict of Faculties, which he had already written a few years before, but held back because of his promise. Now he was saying, well, yes, I had promised to never write about religious matters again, but I had promised to do so as His Majesty's subject, and since that Majesty was gone, since there was now a new king, Kant claimed to no longer be bound by this promise of his. In the second half of the 90s, Kant, now in his 70s, tried to finish up his philosophical system and his legacy. And in those years, he had 2 projects, so to speak, he was working on. For one, he wanted to publish his lectures, some of which he had been giving for about 4 decades. He wanted to publish his lectures as books to bring them to a broader audience. And the other project was that once again he tried to erect a system of philosophy which was built on the foundation of his critique, and a system both of moral philosophy and of natural philosophy. However, he didn't really get to finish either of those two projects because of his progressing age. So as far as his lectures are concerned, he only managed he himself to publish his anthropology in 1799. Then he was too old and too weak to turn his other lectures into books still. And so he gave his notes to friends and students of his and tasked them with turning them into books. So his friend and student Jesche published Kant's Logic in 1800, and his friend and student Ring published his Pedagogy in 1803, and the year before that he published his physical geography. It must, however, be said that these two guys probably weren't up to the task, or it probably also wasn't a possible task, and these three books leave much to be desired, and they can't fully be considered authentic works of Kant. Like, they would have looked different if Kant himself had gotten around to really writing them. And therefore, if you care about these parts of Kant's thinking, you should not just read these three books, but rather you should read Kant's lectures on these topics and his notes dealing with these topics. As for the other project, Kant did manage to write Metaphysics of Morals and publish it in 1798. But there remained the other half of philosophy, natural philosophy. And that is the last project that Kant himself worked on. He believed that the metaphysical foundations of natural science, which he had already published in the 80s, in 1786, still needed to be connected with empirical physics. He said there needed to be a bridge of sorts between the metaphysical foundation and the empirical physics, and that he himself considered to be the last gap in his philosophical system, which needed to be filled to make that system complete. And he, however, didn't manage to fill that gap. He made extensive notes, he wrote drafts, he wrote unfinished manuscripts, and that has later been published in 2 volumes under the title Opus Posthumum. So we can read that and get a pretty good concept of what Kant was dealing with, what problems or questions concerned him, and how he wanted this last major work of his to look like. But he didn't get to finish up that work. And with that, I have reached the end of Kant's life. Since the middle of the 90s, Kant was aging a lot and losing his strength a lot. He gave his last lectures in 1796. Before that, he had never missed a lecture due to illness. But now he was too old and too frail to give lectures, and a few years later, he also pretty much stopped leaving his house, and his body became weaker and weaker. He lost sight in one eye. That actually didn't affect him that much. Other things affected him more. With time, he lost his teeth, so his meat had to be overcooked for him to be able to eat it, and he also, for health reasons, had to stop eating his beloved cheese, which was hard for him, but he did nonetheless. But mostly it was his mind which grew weaker and weaker. Kant himself, in his last years, admitted that it became more and more difficult for him to tune into other people's thoughts and to assume other people's perspectives and to understand what other thinkers, what they even wanted, to understand anything but his own thoughts and his own system. And he also, according to friends and acquaintances, started becoming less tolerant of other perspectives and of disagreements. He started becoming more easily irritated. Irritated when people disagreed with him, but also irritated when things took too long. For example, when the coffee wasn't there fast enough, and when it wasn't cooling fast enough, so he had to wait to drink it. And he also increasingly had problems with his memory. He had to start writing little notes to remember what he had done on a certain day, and in conversations he started to grasp for words, so he often couldn't finish his sentences anymore because he just couldn't come up with the word he needed. And eventually it got to a point where his memory was pretty much gone. There's a very touching report by one of Kant's former students and younger friends named Jachmann, who a few months before Kant's death came to see him one last time, and who writes, and in his writing you can feel his pain, who writes, "My Kant didn't know me anymore," because Kant simply didn't recognize him. Kant was very friendly, and Kant apologized for not recognizing him. But even when they talked for quite a while, and Jachmann tried to remind Kant of times they had spent together and of things they had done together, Kant just couldn't remember him or recognize him anymore. And there's also the report that they tried to lead Kant into his own garden so that he would at least get some fresh air and be outside a little. But even in his own garden, he was disorientated, and he just wanted to get back inside because he didn't really know where he was. Also, apparently, in his last years, he was increasingly plagued by nightmares, thinking that he was attacked by murderers and robbers at night. And even when his mind and when his memory hadn't fully gone yet, in his last years, he complained a lot. You can see that when reading his letters over these last years. He complained a lot about what he called a pressure on the head or a pressure on the brain. And he would always explain that in the vegetative sense, he was still quite healthy, so he didn't suffer any pain in his body. he could still sleep or eat somewhat, but he couldn't do much more than just vegetate. His mind just wouldn't allow him to focus on his work anymore and to continue writing anymore. Also, Kant's daily dinner parties, which had always been very lively, started to become very sad events. Um, there would now only be one or two guests invited, but the thing was that Kant was speaking increasingly quietly and became harder and harder to understand. But he, on the other side, increasingly lost his senses. So not just his eyesight, as I already said, one eye completely stopped working, but he also increasingly couldn't see well with the other eye either. So that eventually he couldn't tell the different dishes apart, and he had to be given his spoon into his own hand with something to eat already on it. And not only his eyesight left him, but also his hearing. So therefore, Kant couldn't really hear what his guests were saying. So a conversation with him was pretty much impossible at this point. But the two guests also weren't really allowed to have a conversation with each other either, because Kant became irritated when he realized that they were talking, but he, because of his hearing, couldn't really listen and understand what they were saying. And therefore, well, they would all eat in silence and in a rather melancholy atmosphere. And with all of that, I think it is no wonder that one person who passed Königsberg in those last years of Kant's, because there had always been people since Kant became famous passing by who wanted to see Kant and meet the famous Kant, the great sage of Königsberg. Some people even visited Königsberg just for that. But one of those people who passed Königsberg later wrote, "I didn't meet Kant, I just met the husk of Kant." And this is, of course, a very sad end for anyone. And maybe if you had an older relative, parent or grandparent growing old and dying, maybe you witnessed similar things, and maybe this will remind you of these things. This is, of course, sad in any person's case, but it is probably especially sad in the case of a great mind and a great thinker such as Kant. He finally died on the 24th of February in 1804, so 2 months before he would have turned 80. And one can probably say that it was better that way, that even if he had died 5 years earlier, neither the world nor he himself would have lost much. It was about time by that point. Once again, as he himself said, he was vegetating but not really living by that point. He did, however, get an unprecedented funeral in Königsberg. More or less the whole city paid him their last respects. And with that, in 1804, Immanuel Kant's life came to an end. And with that, this lecture also shall come to an end. But as I already said, beginning next week, I want to start talking about Kant's actual thoughts and his actual philosophy. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Benjamin Lening, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung cause.